There's not really much of any good way to parse that one out either. I thought I'm going to give it to Ken and let him have a shot at, and that worked good. That worked good. So thank you for being willing to do that. The memory that I'm going to relate here is more of it's more of a feeling than a memory. It is from so early in my life that I just have these vague pictures and feelings related to it. And in fact, I do not know how accurate the memory is either. I was a young boy, much younger than Charlie is now, and my mom had just made some fresh cookies. I really wanted one. But I had either already had one and was told to wait as to not spoil my appetite, or I hadn't had one yet because dinner was about ready or something like that. So this is what I'm saying. This is far enough back that I don't remember all the details. But there was a valid reason why I was not allowed to have a cookie right then. I was going to get a cookie, just not then. But I really wanted a cookie. So while the kitchen was empty, I snuck in and opened the cookie jar to get one, but in doing so, I broke the lid of the cookie jar, and it was one of those nice ceramic cookie jars. Now what's interesting, I do not have a very distinct memory of getting into all that much trouble, or I don't remember a severe punishment or anything like that. I think I remember disappointment more than anything. And I'm sure there was some kind of discipline involved, but the memory or feeling I have attached to this image is more one of grief than anything else. A sadness over having broken something that I could not fix. I had grasped for something that I desired in the wrong sort of way, and as a result, something got broken. I began this series that is looking at God as gardener and his calling for us as his apprentice gardeners in his garden of creation. And we began with creation, God making humans to be in his image, to share in his work, come alongside him and work with him. And we can cite examples of those who have done well to learn from the master gardener as they behaved as true godly stewards of the creation. Being a steward meaning both of what we think of as nature, but also of their fellow human beings. I think of people like Mother Teresa in more recent years, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. I think of Martin Luther King Jr. We need those examples to look up to as showing us what it looks like when we follow the Master's guidance, be life bringers into a wild and broken creation. However, throughout most of history, the opposite has been the rule rather than the exception. Humans have a tendency to grasp and take what they want. And though the desire for the garden, the desire to get back to the way things were, is a God-given desire, again, it says that we have eternity in our hearts, we more often than not act upon that God-given desire in ways that are anything but godly or reflecting the life-giving love of the Creator back into the world. And we can see this especially in the rise and fall of empires throughout history. So, up until this point, we've kind of taken more of the micro approach to things, and more often than not, I do. I tend to try to keep things personal. But once in a while, it is good for us to take that step back and look at the big macro picture of history. And today I want us to look at one particular case in point where God reveals to us where we so often go wrong in the pursuit of His garden. And it centers on King Nebuchadnezzar of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Now, in the Bible, it's just always referred to as he's king of Babylon, which is correct. But from a historian standpoint, what you have to understand is there's an old Babylonian Empire, which is way, way back. And then there's what they call the Neo-Babylonian Empire, meaning the new Babylonian Empire, which was only probably about somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 years ago. So, in historian talk, we call that new. But he was probably the greatest ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was actually relatively short-lived. And we begin our passage with Nebuchadnezzar has had a bad dream. Now, people in those days put a lot more emphasis on dreams than we tend to do now. Whether that's right or wrong, that can be debated. I think more often than not, most bad dreams are the result of eating gas station sushi after 9 o'clock at night. Probably been guilty of that one. But sometimes there's more to it than that. So he's had a bad dream, and he's called in all of the advisors, which we talk about them as being magicians, astrologers, and so on and so forth. But these were also the chief advisors. These would have been like the cabinet for the king. Because they were highly educated and highly trained. And he's wanting them to give him an interpretation of what this dream means, because it weighed so heavily upon him. He knows it must mean something, but they can't do anything. So he brings in Daniel, who's his chief of staff. And he says, I know you can do it, because he's done it before. Back up just a little bit earlier, and we have a different dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and Daniel gave an accurate interpretation. And this dream is interesting. It's filled with garden imagery. A big tree offering shelter and food to all of creation. It sounds like a tree of life. We're going back to the garden here. In this image in the garden, we have the tree of life, the tree of knowledge. I mean, this kind of looks like an image of the tree of life. But then it says one of the watchers, one of the holy ones comes in, and I'm going to avoid going down a deep rabbit hole here, but just very briefly, within Jewish and Christian history, there is this tradition that we refer to sometimes as the Heavenly Council, the Watchers. Without going too far down the rabbit hole, you might just say angels. And the idea was that God is ruler over all, but that He perhaps created some spiritual beings to kind of micromanage some things. That's about as far as I want to go into that. But it's saying that one of those watchers comes down and says, cut down the tree, strip off its branches, scatter everything. The tree is cut down and brought low, and on the surface it's confusing because one would first think of this tree as a parallel to the tree of life. But it is a false tree of life. It is cut down because it has come to think of itself as the tree of life. Yes, it's a big tree. It offers shelter to all and grows fruit for eating. But it is not the tree of life. It is a tree of life. It is a created thing meant to serve a purpose, but it has begun to think of itself as something more than that purpose. It has begun to think of itself as the thing that makes all things live and giving order to the creation. And the verdict of the holy ones is that the Most High, Yahweh, who reigns as the true life bringer and shelter giver. God is the real tree of life in a sense. And this tree that is being cut down, though an image of that life-giving tree, was not the real deal, and it had become arrogant. Only when it would realize its role as a life-giving tree rather than the life-giving tree would things be set right again. So Daniel is brought in to interpret the dream. And Daniel is upset on behalf of the king. He explains that Nebuchadnezzar is the tree in question. He says, your empire has reached far. It is the greatest in history up to that point. It offered order and infrastructure that brought life and well-being to many people. But it was at a cost. And we'll get into that cost here in a minute. But Daniel renders a verdict. He says, turn from your wickedness and be merciful to the poor, in hope that the judgment might pass over. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was indeed truly fantastic. To the west, it bordered the Greek city-states. To the south, it bordered on Egypt. To the east was Persia and the lands bordering India. The buildings of Babylon were supposedly quite fantastic. There was even rumored to be a hanging garden. And Nebuchadnezzar is one of those that is sometimes attributed to the building of that garden. There's never been any proof that it ever exists, but there was definitely legend of it. And even though that hanging garden is not mentioned in this passage, I think to the listeners and readers of the day, they probably would have had the image of that in mind, especially when it talks about the king being this life-giving tree and all this garden imagery. The king had managed to make what seemed to be a veritable paradise and garden kingdom on earth. But there was a problem. Nebuchadnezzar, like many others, was a violent king. He built his empire with blood. The accounts of his siege of Jerusalem are the things of nightmares. Yes, he had a great empire. And he was an amazing ruler for his day. But he did it through violence. And such has been the path of human history in most cases. We look at our achievements as human beings and we boast. But so much of what has been built throughout history has been built on the backs of slaves. Built on the ruins of conquered peoples, ruled through abuse and tyranny. And we may have a desire to build paradise and get back to the garden, but historically speaking, we try to do it through force of violence and manipulation and oppression. And Nebuchadnezzar either doesn't heed or he forgets Daniel's warning. While walking on his palace, he looks out at the city and essentially he's saying to himself, self, you've done pretty good. You're pretty great. You've made something awesome. And immediately at that moment, to the best of our understanding, he loses his sanity. He's driven out. It could be that there may have been a palace revolt, whether it was a military uprising or what, that don't really know for sure. But he was driven out, and he ended up going crazy because of it. And he wandered around on all fours, apparently, eating grass like a wild animal. And he does this until, it says, when he looked up to heaven, his sanity returned. And it is then that he knew that it truly was God who reigned, and that it was God who was the true bringer of order. God invites us to be part of his plan. He invites us to be trees of life, but we are not the tree of life. We are called to do things God's way rather than ours. And when we look through Scripture, most sins can be lumped into one of these two categories. They are usually either sins of idolatry, the worship of false gods, or, it ends up being the same thing, trying to place something else in the place of true rulership in one's life. The old saying is there's a God-sized hole in every heart, and when we try to fill it with something that's not God, things go wrong. That's idolatry. The other group that most sins can be thrown into is abusing the poor, abusing our neighbors, poor stewardship, taking advantage of our neighbors, whether our neighbor be our spouse, the person next door, or the person living on the street. History is a long litany of pain and heartache, and so much of it is caused from us grasping at our heart's desire like a kid getting in a cookie jar unwarranted, rather than holding our hands out to the master gardener, asking him to show us the way. And yes, it is heartbreaking to think about, but it also helps us to realize that there must be another way. The long story of man's inhumanity to man must come to an end. There must be a way back to the garden. When we try to take it by force, we become like beasts, like Nebuchadnezzar. But there must be another way. Starting next week, we will turn towards the one who was sent to show us the way. And interestingly, there will be several episodes that will literally take place in a garden. He will even be mistaken for the gardener at one point. Well, sort of, because really he is the gardener. There is another way back to the garden. And God is showing us in our passage today that He will not be like the kings of the earth. Daniel will later describe Him as a son of man who will rise to sit at the right hand of the Ancient of Days. He will be a human one who is also God. He is the true man who will pass the test of the trees once and for all. And He is the true gardener who will show us the way to life. Amen.